We're facing an urgent crisis, one which threatens our very existence, the climate catastrophe. The climate stability of the past 12,000 years has come to an end, and around the world we are now suffering from the impact. Bleached coral reefs becoming cemeteries, polar regions melting, species driven to the brink of extinction.
It doesn't make any sense if you think we're the most intellectual creature on the planet that we're destroying our only home.
We are at a critical juncture in our planet's history. What each one of us does in the next few years will determine what happens in the next few thousand years. It will define our legacy to all future generations.
One of the things that concerns me the most is just the scale and the urgency of the challenge. If you look at our current emissions of carbon dioxide, they're continuing to increase like this. And if we look at the trajectories that we need to be on if we are to avoid exceeding 1.5 degrees of warming, we need to essentially reverse that today.
It's really obvious that the climate change that we're experiencing is due to human activity, and the reason really comes partly from the ice cores. But from the ice cores we know that the carbon dioxide concentration today at just over 400 parts per million is about 40% higher than it's been at any time in the previous 800,000 years. And that tells us we ought to get climate warming, and sure enough, when we look at the records, we do have climate warming of about 1 degree globally over the last 100 years. So those two things put together are really the smoking gun.
The amount of data we're getting now is just vast, from satellites, from climate models and from our sensors. We need artificial intelligence, or AI, to really tackle some of those large data sets, to look for those patterns and the interconnections in these data sets which were previously hidden to traditional techniques. AI will enable us to build improved predictive models for future climate change. The level of detail from these will be a game changer for governments, for policymakers and businesses who require to make decisions.
The transition we have to make to hit zero carbon in 30 years' time is going to change the whole economy. Every aspect of it is going to have to change.
We need to shift trillions of dollars worth of investment over the next few decades, and they need to be deployed to do things like make all of our homes energy efficient and net zero. We need to have decarbonization of agriculture. We need to see the entire electrification of our energy and power systems so that we can run off all renewables. All of that needs to be financed.
The primary source of greenhouse gas is the way we generate and use energy. It is burning coal, oil, and gas. The biggest opportunity now is that we now have technologies for energy generation and energy storage that are zero carbon. So in Cambridge we have fabulous work on high voltage electronics, which is transforming the way we move electricity around. Our work on batteries is pushing the performance, particularly how long you can use a battery for, to unexpected heights. We have absolutely groundbreaking work on new approaches for solar cells, and the challenge of how we can handle different parts of the solar spectrum more efficiently using a sequence of different semiconductors to pick out different colours is the big opportunity to get the next big drop in the cost of solar.
The generation of electricity that comes from renewable sources was enabled by a huge number of government policies throughout the world, in the US, in Germany, in Japan, and in China, that really created early markets for these technologies while they were still expensive.
The challenge is that the rest of the world is growing richer, faster, and as it does so, it uses more energy.
So the conversation regarding the emerging economies, and I've done a lot of work on China and India, has changed a little bit between the Copenhagen Agreement and the Paris Agreement. Both China and India signed up to the Paris Agreement as equal partners to countries like the UK, the United States, and so forth. And increasingly, these countries are seeing low carbon economy or the green economy as an opportunity more so than a threat. They're investing in these technologies. China is now the largest manufacturer and deployer of solar panels, wind turbines, and lithium-ion batteries. India has put very aggressive policies in place to also both build solar panels, but also try to develop a local manufacturing sector. Increasingly, we're getting to a point where it's not a matter of either or. You can design policies that can try to, domestically, that can try to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also contribute to local development.
Cities, by their nature, are energy-intense environments. And if we, for a minute, just focus on built environments, buildings, just to get to the level where we are even coming close to meeting the 2050 carbon targets, we'll have to be very aggressive in what we do from all angles. A lot of our built environment already exists. We have to be very aggressive about retrofitting it. We have to also continue strategies to incentivize reduction of demand. And finally, that reduced amount of energy per household needs to be supplied by carbon neutral sources such as renewables. In addition to retrofitting built environments, we have a couple of exciting projects that are currently ongoing. One is on urban farming, which is making use of derelict spaces across cities to grow food. So the second project that we have ongoing is on subsurface environments. If we understand where the significant sources of heat are and their magnitude, then we can tackle them sustainably. So we can actually use those heat sources where we have heating needs above ground.
What we eat and how we produce food matters a huge amount, not only for our own health and well-being, but for the planet's as well. Agriculture is the human activity that's transformed the world the most. Producing food takes up 40% of the world's land surface. It's responsible for approximately 25% of human greenhouse gas emissions and also about 70% of freshwater withdrawals. It's vitally important we move to a lower meat and a more plant-based diet. Animal agriculture has a disproportionate impact, a very high carbon footprint. A recent report came out in 2019 that devised a planetary health diet, and essentially they recommend a small amount of meat, fish and dairy, a lot of vegetables, a lot of beans and pulses and some fruit. The amount of meat that they're recommending adds up to about 15 kilos per person per year to feed 10 billion people safely within planetary boundaries. Let's call that 20 kilos per person per year to take into account of food waste. In the UK, on average per person, we're eating 4 times that, like over 80 kilos. And that itself is double what the average global citizen eats. There are many other steps that are also important, but if you're going to make one change, reducing meat and dairy consumption has the biggest suite of environmental benefits.
So decarbonisation is one of the great challenges facing humanity. Electricity production produces about 25% of the world's CO2. And aviation produces about 2% of the world's CO2, but is rapidly growing. We're working on electrical and hybrid propulsion for aircraft. In terms of land-based power, we're working on power generation from low-grade heat, such as solar plants. We're working on tidal turbines, extracting energy from the Earth's tidal flows. And we're working on hydrogen-based cycles, which remove the need for fossil fuels completely. The Whittle Lab is also working on reducing the emission of current technologies. Rolls-Royce is producing its first major new engine, the UltraFan engine, which will reduce emissions by 25%, and the Whittle Lab is doing a lot of research on technologies which will go into that engine. Taking an innovative idea and making it into a reality is an incredibly difficult process. And what the Whittle Lab has done over the last 50 years is, through a close interaction between industry and academia, we've built a bridge to allow these great ideas that are produced in Cambridge to be translated into real products. And that is what is needed if we're going to really successfully decarbonise the power and propulsion sectors.
So we have to work out how within the UK we can get existing and developing and completely new technologies up to scale very quickly. What really makes that work is when it's economically attractive to do so. And there are many ingredients to that. We need skills, we need the right spread of competencies in the UK, we need the right availability of investment, and we need the ambition that that's where we're going to get to.
We have a very exciting research initiative in looking at how we provide a zero carbon future for the world. That has to be complemented by the university itself looking at its own operations and having a pathway to zero carbon for the university. So those targets will worry about different scopes of emissions. So for scope 1 emission, which is largely the gas that we burn on the estate, and we're looking at how to get rid of that. That's going to cost a few $100 million over the next 10 years to get rid of. Scope 2, largely the electricity we buy, to make sure that we're buying that from renewable sources where we can trace the provenance of what we're doing. Scope 3 is hard, that's everything else. That includes air travel. We hope that we will have a policy about limiting air travel coming out this year, and also providing greater transparency about our actual air travel. That Scope 3 includes things like stopping serving ruminant meat in our catering outlets. It also includes everything else we buy. And this is tough, but one of the things that's driving our new procurement system will be consideration of how we account for the carbon in that and how we reduce the carbon by being selective about what we buy and from whom we buy it.
Then we need to play a role in shifting policies, regulations, practices of investment firms and other institutional investors as quickly and as effectively as possible, and preferably based on the research that we do here, so that we're picking the things that are the most effective and moving as quickly as possible in this very brief period we have to make the difference we need to make.
As a climate scientist, I'm deeply aware of the scale of the threat posed by climate change. But at the same time, I really am genuinely optimistic that if we harness the excitement and the energy and the enthusiasm around responding to that great challenge, bringing together the ideas and the innovation, inspiring a future generation of leaders with the skill set that's going to be required to navigate through the coming decades, then maybe we do have an opportunity to really make progress and to tackle this global problem. But above all else, it's very clear this is something on which we cannot fail.
There are huge opportunities to getting things right. The only way to operate is to believe we can do something about it. And I truly think we can.